It's me again. But this time I'm not actually Denise, pastor of MCC. I'm actually Sam Round. So if you know Sam, he's a regular here. In fact, he's one of the ones who's being welcomed into membership next week. Ages and ages ago, I saw a Bible study that Sam had done with these detailed PowerPoint presentations on Job, and I looked at it and I thought, this is fantastic. Like, our congregation could really benefit from this. And so I invited Sam to come and speak. And we've even moved it a couple of times. And here we are today, and Sam's voice is gone, and he's not feeling terribly well. So here I am. I am Sam Round. Sam has been so incredibly organised that he has written his sermon out, sent it to me, and I'm simply going to read it to you. So these are not my words. These are Sam's words. Any disagreements with him, you can take them up with him next week because he'll be here. So tonight's sermon is about looking at God and suffering in the book of Job, which is kind of an over-ambitious thing to try and achieve in 20 minutes. So let's get straight into it with a look at the broad overview of the book. Job, in a nutshell, is all about a righteous man who gets caught up in a cosmic wager between Satan and God, and his life goes to hell. Traditionally, it's been interpreted as a story about the problem of evil, aka why do bad things happen to good people, and what on earth is God doing about it? But it's also a story about being honest enough with God to be angry, about letting our personal experience challenge rigid dogmas, and how God constantly shatters the theology we come up with to make ourselves comfortable. Before we get to all of that, this is quite small, you might not be able to read it, but I've got a summary in front of me anyway. Before we get into all of that, let's have a look at the outline of events. The story starts with Satan waltzing up to God in heaven and asking for permission to test his faithful servant Job by taking away his prosperity. God gives permission for Satan to take his wealth and children and then to torment him with illness. And Sam just wants you to know that he's wondering if Satan is afflicting him right now as a test of his faith. So I'll just put that out there. I'm sure he said that tongue-in-cheek. Despite it all, Job neither sins nor curses God. As Job suffers, his three wise friends come to console him, and they do a really terrible job of it. Job curses the day he was born, asking why he's been made to suffer so much, to which the obvious answer from his friends is, well, he's being punished for his sin. The back and forth arguments begin. Job's friends argue that Job has clearly sinned somewhere, and somehow, because God is perfectly just and only punishes the wicked, therefore Job must repent and get it over with. Job, on the other hand, insists on his innocence, and he rails against God for unjustly targeting him like this. Just as it seems like Job is setting himself up to be struck dead for blasphemy, God appears. And this is what God says. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up your loins like a man. I will question you, and you shall declare to me. God overwhelms Job with talk of his great power. Was Job there when God laid the foundation of the earth? Is Job the one who set the boundaries of the sea? Is Job the one who fathers the rain and gives birth to the hail? Essentially, if Job doesn't even know 0.0001% of the wonderful mysteries of the universe, who is he to be mouthing off about God himself? And so Job concedes defeat. I have uttered what I do not understand, things too wonderful for me that I did not know. So, what's going to happen next? Is Job going to be struck down for his careless words? Well, instead, God turns to Job's friends. And he says, "My wrath is kindled against you and against your two friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has." So Job's friends, who tried so hard to defend God, turn out to be in the wrong. And Job, with all his self-justification and whining, turns out to be in the right. So God restores Job's fortunes to twice as much as he had before, and after much suffering, everything ends happily for Job. So, that's the book of Job. There are 4 main points that we're going to look at tonight that help us to understand a little bit of the book's answer to why bad things happen to good people, although it's not exactly the answer that we want. First is Job's friends, who give the traditional religious answer that we still hear today. Bad things happen to bad people. And if you're suffering, then you must have sinned. On the other hand is Job, who maintains his innocence but also doesn't really have an answer to it all. He cries out against God for acting so unjustly. And so we see a conflict between the two groups, pitting the friends' rigid theology against Job's personal experience. I wonder if that's ever happened to you. And finally, God throws a spanner in the works by emerging from the whirlwind and putting everyone in their place, including Job, who learns that just because he's innocent doesn't mean he has it all figured out. Job's comforters are all about to get a rather harsh theology of reward and punishment, but they start off gently trying to correct their friend. So yes, this is about what Job's friends are trying to convince Job of. They appeal to common wisdom by saying, "Think now, who that was innocent ever perished? Or where were the upright cut off? Job should know from his own experience that good is rewarded and evil punished." But then it all goes downhill and they get very nasty. And they start saying he's full of himself, giving him unsolicited advice about repenting and accepting God's discipline, going on and on about how God's punishment of the wicked is plain for all to see, even victim blaming his children by saying that they deserve to die for their sins. So why are Job's friends so insistent on such a black and white way of understanding the world? It's a good question. Sam's answer is because it takes away a sense of powerlessness. If good merits reward and evil earns punishment, then we can control what happens to us. Yes, a punitive and vengeful God may be scary, but at least to Job's friends, this can never be as scary as a chaotic and meaningless universe. We can store up reward and avoid punishment as long as we do the right thing. Death, disease, divorce, betrayal, famine all become something that we can master rather than things that master us. As Job continues to reject the accusation of being a sinner, his friends get desperate and they start flat out lying, accusing him of stripping the naked of their clothing and starving the hungry. None of this is true, and they know it. But because their little theological system demands that misfortune is always a punishment for sin, they feel entitled to start charging him with all sorts of outrageous crimes without a shred of evidence. Job has gone beyond whatever initial wickedness caused this predicament to even greater wickedness by questioning his friend's theology and, by extension, God, because of course their theology must reflect God. But Job resists. I'm thinking it's the next one. But Job resists his friend's take on events. Throughout the story, he insists on his innocence as God's victim and increasingly despairs of ever getting justice from an overpowering God who can just take whatever he wants. Job genuinely cannot understand why this is happening to him. God knows he's innocent and yet continues to punish him. As the conversation goes on, Job becomes more and more defiant, even willing to fight God to plead his case. Yet even as he slanders God by calling him unjust, he still maintains a strange faith in God's justice, that God will eventually concede that Job is in the right. After all, if Job thought God was totally evil, why bother even arguing? Why hold God to any kind of moral standard? So Job is willing to hold together two difficult, seemingly contradictory beliefs: that bad things happen to good people, but nonetheless, God is ultimately just. How do those things reconcile? It's precisely because Job knows that God is good that Job challenges God. He isn't content to throw up his hands in the air and say God's ways are higher than ours, but rather he wrestles with God. For Job, this isn't just a matter of good theology, it's a matter of integrity. He will not lie about what he's experienced. It would be so easy to simply cave into his friend's pressure. It would make his life easier. It would make the world simpler. It would file everything down into a nice, neat, predictable little box. If good comes to the good and evil to the evil, then we aren't victims. We're in control. We can look down on those who suffer, safe in the knowledge that it's their own fault, while we pride ourselves on being good or smart or making wise decisions. For Job, this isn't about trying to look good or to preserve his reputation. He's just trying to be honest, rather than lying about what he knows to be true, simply to fit other people's pre-made theological systems. He says, "Far be it from me to say that you are right. Until I die, I will not put my integrity away from me. I hold fast my righteousness and will not let it go. My heart will not reproach me as long as I live." And so, perhaps his most cutting criticism of his friends is the accusation that they're lying to defend God. Will you speak falsely for God and speak deceitfully for him? Will you show partiality towards him? Will you plead the case for God? They've constructed and continue to defend such an elaborate system of theology which bears no resemblance to any reality at all. Why does God need lies to defend himself? And so, we have two sides. Job's friends, who insist that everything happens for a reason and that God doesn't make mistakes. Job's suffering is a punishment for his sins, and if he knew his Bible, he'd know that no one is righteous and God punishes sinners. So why does he think his own deceitful heart would know any better? So that's on the one side. Then we've got stubborn Job, who insists that he's innocent. So God must be callously toying with him. He insists on speaking to the manager. He wants to fight God and make God admit that Job is in the right. He rejects his friend's theology by pointing out how regularly the wicked grow wealthy while the poor starve. It all comes down to this idea of integrity. Even if this black and white worldview might make things easier, might make the world a little less scary, might give him a sense of control, Job will not lie to force his own experience into his friend's rigid theology. And so, the heretic is putting his own experience even over the Bible. Imagine that. Psalm 37 verse 25 says, "I have been young and now am old, yet I have not seen the righteous forsaken or their children begging for bread." Who is Job to privilege his own flawed, sinful human heart, deceitful above all things and desperately wicked, over the Word of God. Queer Christians can relate to the argument between Job and his friends. I wonder if you've been sitting there thinking about that. Churches often make judgments about queerness based on how conveniently it fits into their theology, rather than actual queer people's experiences. For example, that same-sex love isn't real, that gayness comes from being deceived by sex-obsessed secular culture. Like Job's comforters, the temptation is to lie and reject experiential evidence in the interests of protecting a theology that says God hates queerness. So queerness has to be a sin that leads only to sadness and misfortune. Anyone who's happy to be gay, married, trans, aro, ace, and single, queer, and celibate is lying to themselves. But like Job, queer Christians insist that they will not sacrifice their integrity and their truth to be palatable to other people's theology. And we don't need to lie just to defend our precious theological systems. At last, we have God, who comes out of the whirlwind. And at first, it seems like he's not happy. Gird up your loins like a man. I will question you, and you shall declare to me. This can be tricky to understand at first because it seems contradictory. God challenges Job and tells him to stuff it because he's God and Job's not. So is Job in the wrong? God doesn't even really dignify Job with a proper response to the problem of evil. When any apologist worth his salt could cook something up about free will or Adam and Eve or something, he just overwhelms Job with his own powerlessness. It's a really cool passage to read. Go have a look at it maybe tonight, just before you go to sleep. But then it turns out it's not Job that God's angry with. It's his friends he's angry with, who need to beg Job's intercession and offer 7 bulls and 7 rams to atone for what they've done. So what's going on here? Why does God dig into Job so harshly and then trash his friends instead? Sam says, I think my 3 main takeaways are: honesty and integrity are the only things that will bring us closer to God, even if it means being angry and frustrated. Job still gets the privilege of a several chapter long lecture from God when his friends get a dismissive sentence. Job's encounter with God is terrifying and it's overwhelming. But when it's an encounter his good religious friends and their apologetics club misses out on entirely. Better a real encounter with the undomesticated God than Job's friends ignoring the living God for an imaginary dispenser of reward or punishment. Being honest doesn't always equal being right. Job's emotions of anger at God and despair with his situation are not wrong. They're all very reasonable emotions to have in response to losing all your children and your material safety. Job was right to speak how he felt. God's perceived abandonment had created a break in the relationship that needed to be repaired, and just suppressing it and going on about his day would have created further distance, not intimacy. But that doesn't mean that the thoughts shaped by these emotions, that God is a cruel, unjust and distant tyrant, were correct. And only by being honest and open about his view of God can God crack these false impressions in our hearts. Perhaps we can relate to how easy it can be to internalise such negative ideas about God, that he wants to punish us and needs to be restrained, that he thinks we're disgusting, that we failed him somehow. These ideas are wrong, but it doesn't mean we're wrong or sinful for having internalised them. being able to name how we feel angry with God can help us realise the lies that we've absorbed. And thirdly, God's personal experience was important. And he was right not to back down on it. But it's not everything. By exposing Job to his infinite power, God puts things back into perspective. Our perspective matters, but it's not everything. And none of us can speak for everyone. To value our personal experience means understanding it's just one piece of the puzzle. By being trapped in his own misery, maybe the risk that Job runs is of letting his suffering become a barrier to others rather than a bridge. Maybe he'll just end up playing Oppression Olympics forever, focusing on how he doesn't deserve to suffer because of his righteousness. But then what about all the other people suffering too? What about the people who do deserve it? It brings to mind Jesus, who also suffered despite his innocence. But his death just served to turn the whole idea of punishment for sin and reward for obedience on its head. Jesus suffers for the sake of the whole world, alongside all who suffer, all who are weak, all who are poor, all who are sinners. And it's precisely through the suffering of one innocent man that the blessing of countless sinners takes place. Maybe after reading Job, we can come away still generally agreeing with Job's friends, just adding a little asterisk at the end. Yes, the wicked will be punished and the righteous rewarded, but there'll be just a few exceptions along the way. But the crucifixion of Jesus sort of implodes that whole thing. God's love is poured out on everyone, totally unearned. The book of Job questions this idea of reward and punishment by suggesting that maybe bad things happen to good people and good things happen to bad people, even if they shouldn't. But the gospel suggests this whole thing is far more muddled than we think. God sends his rain on the wicked and the righteous alike. And while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. The first will be last, and the last will be first. And the tax collectors and the prostitutes are entering the kingdom of heaven ahead of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. Was God ever interested in meting out rewards and punishments? Or is the truth that he sent his Son in the world not to condemn the world, but to save the world? As Dorothy Day puts it, the gospel takes away our right forever to discriminate between the deserving and the undeserving.